Hi, this is Patty Simone. I teach neuroscience-related classes in the psychology department at Santa Clara University, and this tutorial is about the central nervous system, both its organization and its function. When someone receives, this is Dr. Sabatier, and if she reaches out with the right hand and touches something hot, she both, the hand pulls away and she recognizes that she's in pain. And in this module, we'll talk about how that information is kind of processed in the central nervous system and acted upon. The nervous system is divided into both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is further divided into the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system, whereas the central nervous system is divided into the brain and the spinal cord. When someone touches something hot or receives a painful stimulus, the information is first picked up in the somatic nervous system, so the sensory neurons. That sensory information, this red arrow, is sent to the spinal cord, and within the spinal cord, it synapses with an interneuron, and then immediately makes a synapse on a motor neuron. So the sensory neuron and the motor neuron are both part of the somatic nervous system, part of the peripheral nervous system. But that interneuron within the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. And so the central nervous system is made up really of interneurons. It does receive sensory information, and although it's not really depicted in this picture, in addition to synapsing on this interneuron to cause that reflex to pull the hand away, there's a synapse on another neuron, and that information then is going to be sent up to the brain, as this image is showing. So the primary function of the spinal cord really then is just a sensory and motor highway, sensory information coming up to the brain and motor information coming down from the brain. What we're interested really in this module is talking more about, well, what happens to the information when it's in the brain? Usually when we think of the cerebrum, or the brain, we're thinking about the cerebral cortex, which is the outer 3 millimeters covering of the brain. It's really just 3 millimeters thick. It does look gray, and that has to do with the neurons that are there. It's really where neurons are talking to each other. So there's a lot of communication happening here in the cerebral cortex. And what we'll talk about next is our divisions of the cerebral cortex. Because cerebral cortex divisions, the locations have different functions as well. So for instance, if we're looking first at the parietal lobe, located in red, kind of on the top of the brain, that area is pretty large on the cortex, and it's coding for somatosensory information. So it's picking up that information from the painful stimulus in the hand. And if it's the right hand that received that stimulus, then that information is going to go to the left hemisphere, because the brain is comprised of two very similar, not identical, but very similar hemispheres. So what we're looking at here is the left hemisphere looking to the left, and there would be a mirror of that essentially on the other side. So we're looking at the left hemisphere, and if Dr. Sabatier touched that pot with her right hand, then that painful information is making it here to the parietal lobe. In the back of the brain, which is really at the opposite end of where the eyeball would be, but that's where visual information is coded. So the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, green here on this slide, is coding for vision. So it receives visual information from the visual system. The temporal lobe, near the temple, is coding for both auditory information and also language. So it helps us understand auditory input, and that it also helps us create the language that we want to use to articulate what we're thinking. As well as some visual functions as well. So the frontal lobe, so the temporal lobe is audition, language, and also some visual functions. Frontal lobe is sending motor commands. So that purple strip of the frontal lobe is sending motor commands down to the spinal cord, which will eventually, that's what allowed Dr. Sabatier to rub her fingers and blow on them. She brought her fingers up to her face, she blew on it, and those were commands from the central nervous system, the brain. But the frontal lobe, you may notice, is the largest structure of the cerebral cortex. And it really is control of a lot of functions. Largely, we call these executive functions. They have to do with cognition, cognitive control, attention, working memory, things like that. In addition, though, to that outer covering of the brain, there are also structures that are embedded within the brain. These are called subcortical structures. Actually, the first one I want to tell you about is the cerebrum. It's not even, it's tucked in it's the cerebellum, and it's located in the back of the brain there. You see it, that pink structure. Cerebellum is important for motor function and balance. And the purple structure in the middle, called the thalamus, that is known as the sensory relay station. So nearly all sensory information before it gets to the cortex stops in the thalamus first. So that painful stimulus coming up through the spinal cord makes a stop in the thalamus, and then from there it is projected to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Another important structure here is the hippocampus, and this is related to, and the amygdala. These are both related to the experience of burning a hand, because the hippocampus is important for laying down memories. And one would hope that this experience would enable Dr. Sabatier to remember not to touch a hot pot in the future, as well as the amygdala, which is important for emotional processing, especially fear emotions and negative emotions. And so here this is very arousing, and Dr. Sabatier is very likely to remember this episode. So there you have it, sensory information. If the pot is touched with the right hand, that'll travel via the somatic nervous system into the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, it'll travel up to the brain. One of the first stops it'll make is in the thalamus, which is that sensory relay station. From the thalamus, it'll project to in the parietal lobe for somatosensory cortex, so that the brain then is aware, Dr. Sabatier is aware that she's in pain. Once the brain is aware of it, it can help send that motor command from the frontal lobe down through the spinal cord to not only bring the hand up to the mouth, but to blow on it, so that the painful stimulus is diminished. And again, other parts of the brain, like the hippocampus and the amygdala, will help Dr. Sabatier remember to not do this again. So that was our module on the organization of function of the central nervous system. You are now ready to take the quiz associated with this module, and you are encouraged to look through the additional materials that are found at the end of this module for more information.